Okay, so we can start with the homage to the Buddha. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Okay, and today is September 25th? 22nd. Okay. Suddenly my mind went blank on the date. Okay, and we've been doing the Ratthapala Sutta. This is the story about Ratthapala. And of the Buddha's great disciples, there's a passage in the Anguttara Nikaya where the Buddha declares certain disciples to be foremost or outstanding in particular qualities or particular areas of expertise. The Venerable Ratthapala was declared the foremost of those who have gone forth, that is, renounced the household life out of faith. And so the reason that he's declared foremost in this area probably is because he was so determined to go forth that in his family home he sat down or lay down on the floor and told his parents that he's going to remain here until he gets their permission to be ordained. Yeah, it's spicy, all right. Okay, so just to recapitulate where we were last week. So after Ratthapala gets permission to go forth, and he's ordained as a monk by the Buddha, and he's gotten permission on the condition that at some point he'll go back to visit his parents. So then after some time, we're told, after a short time, or not before long, Ratthapala becomes an arahat. And the commentary says that what's meant by in no long time is 12 years. So then he goes back to his hometown, which is some distance from the place where the Buddha usually teaches. Probably about, could be 500, 600 miles, so it must be a long walk. And then when he reaches the town one morning, he's going on alms round, and his father is sitting on the veranda or the porch and sees him in the distance. And then when Ratthapala comes in front of the father doesn't recognize him and just thinks that he's one of those dreadful followers of the ascetic Gautama who stole my son from me. And so his father abuses him and scolds him and denigrates him. And then Ratthapala continues on his alms round, and he sees that a slave woman from the family is about to throw out some stale porridge, and he asks her to put it in his own alms bowl. Then the slave woman recognizes Ratthapala by the marks of his hands, feet, and his voice. She reports this to the family. The parents are so joyful that they declare that the slave woman is now released from slavery. They invite Ratthapala to come to the meal, for the meal the next day. And when before Ratthapala arrives, they've built up a large heap of gold and bullion, covered it with mats or with coverings. They've asked Ratthapala's former wives to adorn themselves, to make themselves most beautiful. Okay, so then Ratthapala comes to the family house. Now we're on page 682. And when he arrives and sits down, then his father uncovers the pile of gold and bullion and tells him, "This is your fortune. Come, give up this monk's life. Use this wealth to do meritorious deeds. You can give up the training, return to the low life, enjoy the wealth, and make merit." Then his father says to him, "If you would follow my advice, you should take this heap of gold, put it on carts, carry it away, and dump it in the river Ganges, because by reason of this heap of gold there will arise for you only sorrow, lamentation, pain, grief, and despair." Now, one question that I brought up last time, or that arose in the discussion, is whether some of the reports of the narration in the sutta is reporting actual fact, preserved historical fact, or whether part of it is a constructed narrative, maybe a fiction, or maybe it's at least details are filled in based on the imagination of the composers. Then one thing that struck me after the class that would seem a little strange, it's on page 682. It's the passage which says that, okay, while the slave woman was putting the porridge in Ratthapala's bowl, she recognized the characteristic features of his hands, his feet, and his voice. Then she goes to the mother and she says, "You should know, my lady, that Ratthapala has arrived." Now, it would seem to me a really intriguing question. How would the narrator of the sutta know that the slave woman recognized Ratthapala by the characteristics of his hands, feet, and voice? When we think, okay, maybe she goes to the mother and tells the mother, Ratthapala has returned. But normally she wouldn't say, it doesn't seem so conceivable to me that she would go to the mother and say, lady, I've recognized the features of Ratthapala's hands, feet, and his voice, so that must be him, that monk standing there. And even if she had reported it in that way, it seems unlikely that the mother is going to come back to Ratthapala and say, Ratthapala, the slave woman recognized you by the features of your hands, feet, and voice. She'd just be so excited that she'll say, Ratthapala, you've come back. Doesn't that seem to be the case? So it seems that the narrator is trying to make, even if there's a basic scaffolding of the story, which is historical fact, but it seems to me that the narrator is trying to make it maybe more interesting by filling in a detail like that. Did somebody read the Chinese version in the Agama? I'm looking at you, Eva. you didn't? You? Okay. Okay. Does anybody have any comments on that or thoughts about that? I mean, I could be wrong, but it just seems to me improbable that this would get caught up in a narration that people are actually going to tell one another. Okay, Boe has some comment. She could take the microphone. I speak more loudly. Yeah. 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 Advising the father. Yeah, that is possible, yeah. But that's not directly connected to the point that I brought up about... No, I think that could be historical fact, actual fact. But the other thing that struck me as a little bit strange last week that I mentioned was in the earlier part of the story when Ratthapala is still a young man living at home, and then he makes a determination to go forth. When his parents failed to dissuade him from that purpose, then they ask his friends and companions to go try to persuade him. But there's no mention there of his wives. They don't send his wives to go to persuade him. But later, when he returns home, then they tell, the parents tell his wives to adorn themselves in the way that Ratthapala thought that they were beautiful. And so suddenly there's a mention of wives, not mentioned in the earlier part of the story. Again, that seems a little peculiar to me. But some of the explanations that came up last week in the discussion seem to provide some basis for believing that Ratthapala could indeed have been married, but just the wives weren't sent on the scene because at that point they wouldn't have had the authority to persuade him to give up his idea of going forth. Okay, so let's now continue with the rest of the sutta. Okay, so after Ratthapala rejects the gold, now we're starting the next section. This is section 23. So now Ratthapala's former wives come up to him and they grasp his feet. And then they say to him, "What are they like, my Lord's son, the nymphs for whose sake you lead the holy life?" Okay, so this was maybe a belief in some quarters of ancient India that the reason that you lead that you renounce the world and lead the spiritual life, that you renounce the sensual pleasures in this life so that you'll be able to get a heap of merit and be reborn in one of those heavenly worlds where the devas there, the male devas, are surrounded by a harem of, 20 beautiful, they call them apsaras or nymphs. And so we have some of these legendary figures like, the rishis with the big beards, the long flowing hair, clad in just a loincloth, sitting in the forest under the tree, their bodies, just bone and skin. But when they're sitting there meditating, what they're meditating on are the beautiful damsels that they'll be able to enjoy when they get reborn in one of the celestial heavenly worlds. So apparently the wives of Ratthapala must have believed that he was living this life of renunciation in order to be reborn in one of these heavens and be able to enjoy the company of these celestial nymphs. So then Ratthapala replies, "We do not lead the holy life for the sake of nymphs, sisters." So now he's calling them sisters. And when they hear that, then they cry out and they faint. It seems, I don't know, one has to have some understanding of maybe the woman's psychology to know why they would faint if they were called sisters. I mean, if Ratthapala was living at home as, their husband, and then one day he started to call them sisters, one could see that they would think it rather strange, but now he's come as a monk, so why should they faint?
I think that's the final rejection of them as wives.
Okay. So Barbara says that she thinks that this is putting like the sort of stamp of definiteness, the final rejection on their status as wives. Okay, Richard, pass the microphone back to Richard. Mm.
People are able to class other people in their family very easily. You can simply say, you call someone a sister, and then that means you're committed to treating them as a sister, and it's all incest rules apply. And that allows the women to relax entirely and be informal and all that because there's no threat of sexual relationship.
Yeah.
It's really a very absolute bar, and it's done verbally, and it's done without backing by the state, because it's basically the family that is the only working institution.
Yeah.
So it's a very, very strong difference. Indian women are very shocked to be entered into one category when they think they're in the job.
Okay. So Richard says in brief that when he calls them sisters, it marks a very drastic, radical change in their status. So now it means that once he calls them sisters, that any possibility of a sexual relationship is completely out of bounds. Perhaps they would have been hoping, this was like their last hope to drag him back to the household life. And now when he calls them sisters, it means that there's no possibility of that. Suki. Whenever what?
Whenever they have some kind of surprising kind of story or any shocking story, even now a lot of women just faint.
They faint.
Probably in their mind, they need to faint or whatever, but I see a lot of women when they have children doing something really horrible. Instead of being reasonable and talking, first they just faint. It's very simple, a description of what happens. That's the way I
But certainly it has to do something with his labeling them as sisters, because the text says that they call out, "Our Lord Ratthapala calls us sisters," then they cry and faint. Okay, so anyway, let's continue. Okay, so it seems Ratthapala now, so he's in Arhat, he's getting a little impatient with all of these sort of tricks that the family is trying to play on him. First, they tried to lure him away from the monk's life with money, with gold. Then they tried to seduce him back to the household life with the former wives dressed up beautifully. So now he says to his father, "Householder, if there is a meal to be given, then give it, but don't harass me." Okay, so finally the family relents and they present Ratthapala with his meal. Then when he finishes the meal, then he just puts his bowl away, he stands up, and he utters some stanzas, which it seems are mainly addressed, or at least they're referring to the former wives. And I have to say, you know, the way sometimes, like, when there's a news report to take place, maybe if there's been a suicide attack in Iraq or Afghanistan, before the report comes, they say some of the pictures that you're about to see are unpleasant. So if you feel sensitive about these matters, please don't attend to this report. So if you feel rather sensitive about some of the lines that I'm going to read out in the verses, please close your ears or don't read them. Okay. Behold a puppet here pranked out. The puppet is referring to, I guess, to the wives who have been decked up beautifully. A body built up out of sores, sick, an object for concern, where no stability abides. Behold a figure here pranked out, with jewelry and earrings too, a skeleton wrapped up in skin, made attractive by its clothes. Its feet adorned with henna dye. I think it's a kind of red dye that you still see it in India in the villages. Women put it on the feet. Here in the West, women put call it nail polish on the toenails. But in India, they put this henna dye, they put decorative patterns on the feet. So its feet adorned with henna dye and powder, face powder smeared upon its face. It may beguile a fool, but not a seeker of the further shore. Its hair is dressed in eightfold plaits. Maybe a little allusion there to the Noble Eightfold Path as a counterfoil to that. An unguent smeared upon its eyes. It may beguile a fool, but not a seeker of the further shore. A filthy body well adorned like new painted unguent pot. It may beguile a fool, but not a seeker of the further shore. The deer hunter set out the snare. The snare was the gold and the former wives. But the deer, that's Ratthapala, did not spring the trap. We ate the bait and now depart, leaving the hunters to lament. Very powerful verses. What do you think? I see Sandy is sort of shriveling up her face a little bit. To make you more comfortable, I have to tell you that if there's some tendency in early Buddhism that I don't really resonate so well, it's with this disparagement of the body. It seems to me to be taking things to an extreme.
Yes, what I was going to say was, I think he's done too much meditation in charnel breath. I'm struck by the cruelty. I'm sure he didn't mean any of this in our body. He couldn't have meant it.
Yeah.
But that's how it is. you learned your lesson that we're all swords and skeletons.
Yeah, but don't inflict it on us. It might be the case, again, that, well, I think these verses do come, there's a collection called the Therigatha in the Pali Canon. It has a counterpart in the Chinese Tripitaka. These are the collected verses of the elders. There's the Therigatha, the verses of the elder monks. The Therigatha, the verses of the elder nuns. And within the Therigatha, there's a section for Ratthapala, and these verses are included amongst Ratthapala's verses there. So there seems to be at least a correspondence between the text of the Majjhima Nikaya and Ratthapala's verses in the Therigatha. It's possible that Ratthapala actually didn't speak them on this occasion, but he spoke them, well, they do seem to fit the situation. No, I don't know. But I would say, again, I'm putting Venerable Ananda in this situation, Venerable Sariputta. I don't think they would speak hard verses like this, but they would say, sisters, let me teach you the Dhamma. And then they'll start with a graduated teaching. Start speaking about the benefits of giving, generosity, about the benefits of sila or moral observance, and then gradually build up, and then come to the Four Noble Truths, the Noble Eightfold Path. But also, it's just possible that these are the verses that Ratthapala spoke, and maybe he saw that these women had really fixed delusions about their own beauty, and maybe pride and conceit based on their beauty. One would think that if they were really proud, they would have, especially if it were 12 years, I don't think that they would hang around in the parents-in-law home, but they would try to gain some kind of release from the marital ties in order to seek another husband. I remember there's a sutta in the Anguttara Nikaya where there is a young man who has, I think it was 4 wives. He's a young man with 4 young wives, and he goes to hear the Buddha preach. And when the Buddha gives his discourse, this young man, on the spot of the moment, he becomes a non-returner, an anagami, not bound to come back to this world, which means that he's cut off craving for sensual pleasures. And when he becomes a non-returner, then he takes what are called the 5 precepts, with celibacy as the 5th, which means that he takes the precept in which complete sexual abstinence replaces avoiding or abstaining from sexual misconduct. Then when he goes home, he calls his 4 wives to him, and he says, "My dears, I've now become a disciple of the Buddha, and I've taken these precepts with celibacy as one of the precepts. So I now release you from the marital bonds you had to me. If you want, you can go home to your parents. If you want to get married to another man, you can go off to that other man. Or if you want to stay here at home and live the celibate life with me, you can do so." And then the women make different decisions. And so it would seem to me that unless they were living for 12 years in the really strong hope that Ratthapala would return to them and then become their husband again. But if it didn't work out after 1 or 2 years, I think that they would come to their senses and realize that he's not going to come back. Anybody have any ideas about that? Excuse me? No mention is made of them having any children. That's possible too. Yeah, because it's the leading family. Yeah, it's the leading family in this town. Yeah. Okay, Richard has some comment. Use the microphone, please. A little bit, I think. Mm-hmm. Yeah. 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 And also, I don't know whether that regulation would have already been observed in the time of the Buddha. I wonder that might have come in the work that, the Hindu law books, like the laws of Manu, which do come from a somewhat later, several centuries later. Mm. 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 Oh, I see, I see. But I don't, this seems to be a wealthy, prestigious family. I don't know whether the family would allow the former wives to become aunties. And that's... Mm. Mm. Yeah. Mm. Mm. Yeah. 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 Anyway, coming back to sort of the tone, this kind of tone, this way of looking at the body, it seems to me one has to look at the body in, from at least two perspectives. And I have to say, when I was living in Sri Lanka, I did my share of not going to the charnel grounds, which they don't have anymore, but we used to go. It became like the in thing for the monks to do is to go to the hospitals, have the morgues, and usually the doctors who were working in the morgues are devout Sinhalese Buddhists, and so when monks come, they allow them to come in and to observe the autopsies. And so I've seen a fair number of autopsies, maybe 4 or 5 times. They have the body, it's kept in a kind of box, and they open up the box and they take out the body and they put it on the table. It looks like it's 100% alive. The guy's not moving around, but it seems like he's in a deep sleep. Then the doctor will take up the scalpel and put it to the skin, and I'm almost about ready to scream out, "Don't cut him like that!" But he'll cut open the body, and they take out the parts, and they know the 32 parts mentioned in the classical texts, so they'll take out those parts which are tangible, concrete and tangible. Like, this is the heart. Here's the large intestine. These are the small intestines. This is the liver. Could you show me the spleen, please? Okay, there's the spleen. Then the most sensitive part is where they cut open the scalp. Then they have to, they cut the skin of the scalp. Then they have to use some kind of saw. It's like a little saw, and they cut open the skull, and then they take out the brains. I remember one time I went with this English monk who had been living like a really rigorous ascetic type of life, not staying fixed at any monastery, but always walking from place to place. And somehow we met up in Colombo and we both decided to go to the morgue to observe an autopsy that day. And we were standing there watching it, and this rather ascetic temperament, this monk with an ascetic temperament said to the doctor, "Do you have as we were watching, he said, "Do you have a chair I could sit on?" I'm feeling a little faint. Yeah, but, okay, so from one angle one could see that the impression of the body as being beautiful and attractive does rely to a great extent on illusion or projections. But there's also something, I would say, that's marvelous and extremely intelligent about the working of the body, the way all the different organs and tissues function together with a great deal of harmony to take care of all of the functions. Like if I get a cut on my skin, I don't really have to pay much attention to it. Maybe I just put a little antiseptic on, but I don't have to control it. It'll just grow the right kind of cells by itself and the wound will heal. The heart is beating, it's a terrific worker. If anybody should get paid the CEO's salary, it's the heart that's beating away how many times? Maybe 70 to, excuse me? You figured it out. I was going to say 70 to 100 times a minute. You multiply that by the number of minutes a day, every day of our life. Wow, we go to sleep. The heart doesn't sleep. And then when we have to figure out a problem, or recognize a figure, or write a paper, prepare a speech, all of the brain cells are working together. We have to do the thinking, but the brain cells provide the manpower that sees that all of these mental functions can take place. And when we go for a walk, we don't have to tell the muscles to move in coordination. We just say, I'm going to walk, and we could be speaking with a friend, thinking about a musical tune, trying to memorize a passage from the suttas, or just be mindful of walking. And the brain, nervous system, muscle system, bones are all working in this marvelous, marvelous process of coordination. Okay, so anyway, this is Ratthapala now expressing his perspective on the body to his former wives. And perhaps, it's just possible that when his former wives heard this is the kind of thing that the commentary would say, as they heard this, they became stream enterers, or once returners, or non-returners. Okay, so then Ratthapala leaves his family, and then he goes to this garden. It's called Migachira Garden. It's the garden where the deer are dwelling. And it belongs to this king. Apparently this must be the king of this particular region, named Kauravya. So the king addresses his gamekeeper to go and tidy up the garden so that we may go there for our pleasure. And as the king is as the gamekeeper is cleaning up the garden, he sees the Venerable Ratthapala sitting there for the day's meditation. And then, this is interesting, the gamekeeper somehow recognizes Ratthapala. The father didn't recognize him, but the gamekeeper recognizes him. And says that, he reports to the king and says, while I was cleaning up the garden, I saw that the clansman Ratthapala is there, the son of the leading clan in this town of Tulakotita, of whom you have always spoken highly. He's sitting at the foot of the tree for his day's abiding. Again, it's peculiar. The gamekeeper recognizes Ratthapala, and the king has been speaking about him highly. Of course, the 12 years is, that information comes from the commentary, which can be exaggerating the time period. So suppose it's not 12 years, but maybe 2 or 3 years that Ratthapala was away, for the gamekeeper to recognize him, for the servant women at home to recognize him. We could see that the father might not recognize him because he's forming this judgment from a distance, and his anger and resentment could blind him to inaccurate perception of Ratthapala. But I would think for the gamekeeper to recognize him, it can't be after 12 years. It would have to be a much shorter period.
I think it may be a comment on status. That is, the Buddha does not share in the caste system, and he doesn't share prejudice against women. He also admits untouchables. And so he also thinks that people on the bottom of society are often more perceptive, more intelligent than people higher up in society. I think that this is the observation about the servant recognizing him and the gamekeeper recognizing him are both assertions that the people at the bottom are actually more perceptive of people.
Yeah, that I don't really know whether there's a kind of a underlying agenda like that in the sutta. I mean, it might be the case in actual fact. Did Barbara, you were going to say something?
Yeah, I don't know. I would see it a little differently.
Yeah.
That they aren't blinded the way the father is. I mean,
Yeah.
the father has a thing
Yeah.
about blind.
Okay. Okay. Yeah.
Gold-pated recluse.
Yeah. Yeah.
Every time he sees one,
Yeah.
that's what he gets.
Yeah.
So he doesn't notice that his son is inside.
Yeah. Yeah.
The relationship is repeated with the king and the gamekeeper. That is, there's the same relationship between the king and the gamekeeper that there is between the father and the servant. Like that is the servant and the gamekeeper both know who the father is, and the father that is the servant and the gamekeeper, and the father and the king both don't know.
Well, no, there's a difference here in that the father actually saw Ratthapala in the distance, but didn't recognize him. The king hasn't yet been exposed to Ratthapala. Apparently the king, he might have seen Ratthapala years earlier when Ratthapala was just a young man, but then he might not have, he wouldn't have paid any attention. He's just, a kid or a young man in this town. But when he heard the report that Ratthapala, the son of this most wealthiest, most prestigious family in the town, had renounced to become an ascetic, that would have made a strong impression on him. And so he came to have a high opinion of Ratthapala. And maybe reports came through that Ratthapala was living a very pure life and became an arahant, a holy one.